Mario 64 is an interactive painting. That much can be discerned easily from the game's premise, in which Mario literally jumps into paintings and interacts with the worlds they contain. But there's more to that statement than meets the eye. Mario 64 doesn't just have paintings baked into its premise, paintings inform the storytelling language of the game in interesting ways. Paintings are not like movies, for example. They don't tell stories through a sequence of events forming a plot. Instead, paintings are moments captured in time, just an image from which feelings and ideas are evoked. This is how Mario 64's storytelling functions. While there is a skeleton of a plot, the actual story is told through little vignettes of moments caught in time. The interactive painting element of the game was no coincidence. It is the point of Mario 64. In my previous video, I discussed the concept of scene, a somewhat abstract quality of how video games can replicate the storytelling of paintings by portraying a vivid image using simultaneous rendering of a game space, rather than through the sequential storytelling we're accustomed to from film. Games do often borrow from film, including using sequencing to stitch together areas so that they feel continuous, mimicking the ways in which movies construct physical continuities via camera angles and cuts between them. This cut and paste method of spatial information also tells a story sequentially as a consequence. Paintings, on the other hand, are capable of conveying the entire story the artist wishes to articulate all at once within the frame. While games don't always operate in such a way that the camera allows the player to see all of the action at once, a lot of games portray their physical space continuously in a way that creates the same simultaneous story effect. This means that games tell stories in a way that's actually far more like paintings than we realize, because games are able to convey meaning through moments suspended in time. Rather than telling us the story through a plot, games, like paintings, can often tell us a story through scene. Think of scene as like the scene of a painting. Paintings don't have a plot, they just have the scene. Mario 64's storytelling is interesting because it actually evokes this quality of paintings deliberately. Mario 64's worlds are not just paintings that contain worlds within them, they're worlds that function as scenes. Let's explore Mario 64 through this concept of scene. First, let's look at Bob-omb Battlefield. The space of Bob-omb Battlefield tells a story. The level's first moments always position Mario at the base of a field with both Mario and the camera angled to face toward the castle-like foothill. At the top of this hill stands the King Bob-omb. The story that Bob-omb Battlefield tells is interesting because it sets a scene that is reminiscent of the original Donkey Kong. The hero situated at the bottom, framed as an underdog against a much larger threat who stands at the high ground. It's really simple visual storytelling, the kind of image that transcends language and cultural barriers to be able to be universally understood through basic narrative framing. Mario is the hero, King Bob-omb is the villain, and we know this just because of where they're positioned in the scene. There's also a world narrative going on in Bob-omb Battlefield, and it's in the level's name. It's a battle zone between warring factions, the red and black Bob-ombs. The red Bob-ombs are friendly to Mario and are the first NPCs that Mario will interact with aside from Toad and Lakitu in Peach's castle. Not only does this establish the concept of a friendly NPC, which was at the time a relatively new concept for a platformer, but also establishes the red Bob-ombs as sharing an underdog status with Mario, given their placement alongside Mario at the low ground in the battle zone. Given that King Bob-omb is implied to rule the land and is literally a king that's bigger than all the other Bob-ombs, there's an implication of a class struggle in its vaguest possible sense. This not only frames Mario's actions as an act of good Samaritanism, which becomes a recurring theme in 3D Mario games, but also as fighting a righteous fight for the downtrodden and against the elite. The scene that Whomp's Fortress sets tells a remarkably similar story. The constant upward trajectory of the space gives off the impression of an impenetrable fortress that Mario has to traverse in order to dethrone the titular Whomp. This time, however, there isn't a similar world narrative of a battlefield, and instead Mario is positioned as a bit of a one-man army. We can clearly understand the Whomps to be hostile and angry just on their visual design and behavior, so it's easier to empathize with Mario. But Whomp's Fortress doesn't do as strong of a job in communicating a theme as Bob-omb Battlefield before it. The first star, chip off Whomp's block, also ends in a boss battle, but whereas King Bob-omb was implied to be royalty, the dialogue for Whomp implies Whomps to themselves be the downtrodden, claiming, "We build your houses, your castles. We pave your roads, and still you walk all over us." The reason why this interests me is because at first it seems to betray the concept of Mario as representing the downtrodden in some way, but really this is just an issue with translation. Basically, this whole situation is meant to be a bit of a visual pun. He's saying, "You walk all over us because he's a stone." I watched a video by YouTube channel Norky where he broke down the original Japanese for Mario 64, and learned that in the original context, Womp is basically saying, "It's because of us stones that you're able to build your homes and castles, and yet you never show any gratitude." It's meant to be an absurd visual pun, amounting to, "You walk all over us stones, so how's about we walk all over you?" Something that only loosely translates through the English text, but is pretty obvious from the actual presentation and design of Womp. That change from "because of us stones you can build houses" to "we build your houses" is something that actually does make some difference, because it changes the narrative from the materials to the labor. If Womp literally built people's houses, Mario's actions would seem really mean-spirited. But if we get that Womp is saying that stones are used to build people's houses, then it makes sense as an absurd joke, operating on a sort of cartoon logic of the brick who fought back. If I had to pick my favorite level as far as how a scene is set that tells a little story, it would be Jolly Roger Bay. Jolly Roger Bay explores a theme that was relatively new for Mario. Fittingly, it's a theme of exploration. Jolly Roger Bay is less, for lack of a better word, combat focused compared to other levels. Instead, it's just a journey to explore the remains of a sunken ship. Mario is positioned to start on land and then journey his way into the water. The point of interest naturally converges at the base of the bay, where an eel sits inside the window of the ship. When Mario explores further, he returns to find the eel is gone and he can enter the ship through its hollowed out window. This is one of the first of only a few loading zones that form a sequence within a level in Mario 64. We started outside the ship, and then, like as if via a cut in a movie, we suddenly find ourselves in the ship's interior. I love this method of continuity in games because it resolves an issue with orientation that often becomes a problem in game design. You need to make players feel like where they are when an area loads makes sense relative to whatever information they had last on their character's whereabouts. This hard-cut approach to game continuity can easily get jarring, especially if you do it too frequently. But when you do it just right, it feels so seamless that most players don't even think about how much work goes into unloading an area, loading a new area, and preserving a sense of continuity between the two. Of course, Mario 64 operates to some degree on cartoon logic, so when we enter the ship, we find its interior vastly bigger than its exterior. Mario explores the ship, solving a puzzle which drains the water inside. It's only when we enter the level for a second time that we discover that Mario has managed to be able to resurface the ship somehow, returning life to the land. Now, again, this is all very abstract, and it lacks a broader world narrative. Instead, the narrative presented here is one of mostly emotional qualities, feelings of discovery, wonder, awe. But it's awe situated in the context of a scene, one of a fallen ship and a world of life that has grown on and around it in the seabed. This is a peak example of how Mario 64's storytelling is like that of paintings. The sunken ship tells us nothing about it, but there's still a story to be discerned from its mere presence. At some point, the ship had to sink, which meant that people aboard likely died. The ship is a tragedy, but the fact that aquatic life has grown on, in, and around it makes the tragedy bloom into something beautiful. One could see humanity as insignificant in this moment, or instead as uniquely significant. But that's what makes this kind of visual art so valuable, that it opens a window for us to find our own meaning inside of it. Cool Mountain is a fairly carefree level. Snow levels in Mario games tend to be less intense narratively. In this case, Cool Mountain doesn't have one specific narrative, but instead a number of smaller vignettes: a race against a penguin, helping a snowman reunite with his body, finding the lost penguin and reuniting him with his mother. This is true of all of the levels in the game, but in the snow levels, the vignette nature of Star Collection is emphasized because of how much the stories rely on different characters. Cool Mountain also further establishes the notion of Mario as a Good Samaritan. I want to eventually make a video covering Super Mario Sunshine in detail because I think that game is the culmination of the notion of Mario as a Good Samaritan. The Mario franchise is often caught between the idea of Mario being a more traditional hero, saving the world or conquering evil, versus Mario just being a guy who wants to do the right thing no matter how big or small. The nice thing about the star collecting structure of a lot of the 3D Mario titles is that it allows the games to explore both sides of Mario without them coming into conflict. Mario is simultaneously trying to save the princess, and is helping a snowman reunite with his body, a penguin reunite with his mother, etc. Contrast this with 3D World, which, although being a game I love, sacrifices these smaller satisfying stories for a continuous plot revolving around the pursuit of Bowser. Cool Cool Mountain's scene is particularly interesting because of how much it betrays its own concept. Contrast it with Tall Tall Mountain. Both are mountains, but Cool Cool Mountain is literally floating in the air. What I love about this is that, despite this being obviously the case, nobody ever really questions Cool Cool Mountain as a mountain. It's an example of how much abstraction is allowed in early 3D games. We all understand it as an approximation of a mountain, a general impression of one, and it's because we experience it as such when we play. It's designed so that no matter what the player does, they're going continuously downward from a peak. This design allows it to be floating out in the open as if it's a planet in space, but still give off the impression of a mountain to where players just passively accept it as one. The scene of a level isn't about how realistic or believable it is, it's about how it feels to play. Because it feels like a mountain, it's a mountain. Shifting Sandland is a bit similar to Jolly Roger Bay in that all of the stories of Shifting Sandland converge on one central point of focus, the pyramid. Shifting Sandland is one of the most traditional adventure levels in the game, telling a story of an adventure based on the trope of archaeological exploration. The pyramid is a mystery housing a mystic secret, which Mario eventually unearths in atop the 4 pillars. And while this story involves an actual sequence going from outside of the pyramid to deep within its interior, the implied story is still available just from the external area of the map. Given well-known knowledge of pyramids as sites of ancient religious and political power, a cursory glance at Shifting Sandland suggests that the pyramid as a centerpiece of the level imbues it with some unknown, potentially supernatural significance. Shifting Sandland is one of those levels that most properly resembles the composition of a painting. Like how a painting of a church can be framed to make the building take up so much of the space and scale that the people are left fairly small in the frame and without much detail, turning them into objects surrounding the subject of the church itself. Shifting Sandland makes the pyramid so significant that players will immediately recognize the world of the painting as not only centering on the pyramid, but also making the pyramid the reference point for everything else. Where is Klepto going? Towards the pyramid. Or away from the pyramid. Where are the 4 pillars? Surrounding the pyramid. Where is the giant stone maze? Just a little bit north of the pyramid. It's an example of how game spaces are composed, not just in terms of layout, but in terms of scale. What takes up most of a game space? What sites of significance are there? And how are they placed in order to create an implied sequence, even when being able to traverse them in any order? After all, Mario 64 has open-ended level design, so the level needs to find a way to make it clear that the best way to the pyramid is around to the stone maze, and then back towards the pyramid from the north. The idea is that this is the best method because it's the least skilled method, so that way new players aren't encouraged to take a lot of risks, and to leave riskier options for skilled players to save time, such as collecting the wing cap or riding the Koopa shell. Big Boo's Haunt is the most overtly horror-themed level in Mario 64, and the very first image of the level will immediately convey this. The camera's view is obscured by this massive, imposing mansion. There's only one place to go: inside. And as with the tradition of a spooky mansion, it is a sprawling series of traps and creepy encounters. While most of the levels have a clear ludic arc, this one has a deliberately obfuscated one. After all, the maze-like nature of the mansion is meant to confuse and disorient, to lead one into new horrors and back around into old ones. So rather than a clear best way to go, the level leaves the player to gradually create a mental map of where they have and haven't been, in the hopes that they'll figure it out. Of course, the level also contains the scariest moment in any game ever. The piano, I think, does the best job of conveying the scene of the level. Lit by the moonlight appearing softly through a window, the piano is the only item of interest in an otherwise ominously empty room. The moonlight draws you to it. There's a light element of mystery, but also a false sense of comfort that is betrayed when, upon approaching the piano, it grows a mouth and begins chomping its way towards you. This room is so unnerving that I straight up try to avoid accidentally ending up in it, and will sometimes leave the room on entry rather than venture inward at all. It uses simple, non-verbal methods of storytelling to help sell a truly horrific moment. And this moment is clever because it situates the piano as part of a series of rooms that all have their own horrors contained within. But whereas other rooms have booze, floating eyeballs, and coffins, this room is the only one that feels at first to be totally peaceful, tricking the player into being curious enough to explore. It's that discomforting quiet that gets betrayed that makes the moment stick in the minds of so many. While the piano jump scare is easily the most terrifying aspect of this room, there's more to say about the room itself, like how the room is completely undecorated and made entirely of wood, creating this feeling of solitude and absent emotions, or how the piano and chair, being the only objects to furnish the room, sit next to a window, allowing the implied pianist to gaze longingly out into the night. It reminds me of the sorrow present in a lot of Gothic horror, as though this piano belonged to a lonely woman who died tragically and whose ghost still haunts the mansion. If one were to view this scene the way we would a painting, you could have so much to say just from where the piano is placed in the scene, and the absence of any human subjects. My favorite levels are the ones that tell a story with a progression, like in the case of Wet Dry World. Wet Dry World first feels like just this abstract area. We can pick apart a couple of details about the scene. The bricks make clear to us that there's some element of civilization, that this isn't a place that's meant to be submerged in water. But later into the level, Mario will discover a path to a new area, a town. This little moment suggests that there was once civilization here, but it fell. There's an implication that the town has become flooded, that it's been uninhabitable for probably quite some time. Especially contributing to this feeling is the fact that there are no living creatures in the town. It's a town that time forgot. For me, this creates a feeling of loneliness, but also wonder, as though we're finding ourselves in a place where people once were, and recognizing some unknown past, but not being able to fully uncover it. Instead, it remains a mystery, just like the sunken ship in Jolly Roger Bay. And that's the kind of feeling that Mario 64 evokes the best. If one were to view Wet Dry World as a painting, what is the perspective of the painter? Is the town's seclusion a hint at an inner desire for isolation from the social world? Is it a lament for a world that no longer exists? Is it curiosity about lost cultures? Is the town a literal representation of something, or just a metaphor? It's this abstract, emotional feeling that a lot of newer games fail to achieve because they never even set out to hit us on that level. It doesn't mean nothing, but it almost doesn't mean anything specific. It's just a feeling, an experience, and it's an experience that we make our own, both as we play and as we reflect back on it. For me, the town in Wet Dry World is a discovery that creates this feeling of returning. It's like I recognize the social nature of the town in a way that the rest of the level didn't evoke. The rest of the level is abstract, like a children's toy set. But then we find the town and it's clear that this place is more than just a series of random objects. It reminds me to an extent of the levels in the Mario Galaxy games, which were more disjointed and were able to experiment with mashing different aesthetics and ideas together without requiring any strict coherence. But there still was coherence. It was just coherence that only clicked when you saw it through the lens of Mario's journey through the level, like a puzzle that becomes solved only when you follow the steps. Mario 64's lack of linearity meant that this puzzle-like element was a bit more obtuse. There's not a requirement to ever go to the town in Wet Dry World. I'm sure for a lot of players at the time, and for young players in general, they may never have found the town on initial playthroughs, because it's one of the most difficult areas in the game to reach, and it's optional to get the 2 stars in the town in order to beat the game. So the moment when it clicks is one that players have to find for themselves, with no guarantee that they ever will. In this sense, the level really touches on what makes paintings special. Paintings don't hide their meaning, but their expressiveness doesn't require that the meaning ever be found. The town in Wet Dry World is clearly significant, but the significance is up to the viewer to articulate. The Bowser levels are fairly interesting. Each one becomes increasingly abstract in both its level design and presentation. These levels look like a child's playset, with disconnected level geometry that sometimes doesn't even cohere aesthetically, jumping from metal to stone, to checkerboard patterns, etc. These levels, importantly, aren't presented as paintings, but yet their design follows a surrealist sensibility that is reminiscent of paintings regardless. I think that these levels are meant to be a very literal transcription of the platforming of the 2D games into 3D. In 2D platformers, abstract and linear level design is more permissible without needing to justify itself to the player. But for Mario 64, they show these abstract areas only sparingly, and only after considerable time has been spent in levels with more clear themes. Not all the levels are easy to discuss in detail. Some levels, like Lethal Lava Land, are just too abstract to really discuss in a story-like manner, as it feels primarily like an aesthetic experience. Other levels, like Tick-Tock Clock and Rainbow Ride, are just too straightforward with their concept that I don't know if there's anything I can add. Tall Tall Mountain, for example, is really straightforward, having most of its stars up near the top of the mountain. Unlike Bob-omb Battlefield, there isn't a narrative formed by scaling the mountain except for its most literal interpretation. Mario went up a mountain. Rainbow Ride carries over a concept explored in Mario 3, the fantasy of a world in the sky. Its premise doesn't manifest in very much of note in the actual level itself. It's not like Jolly Roger Bay, where a story gets told through the course of multiple stars. It's just a world in the sky. And it's interesting because of how sparse its level geometry is, how much of the game space is actually just literal empty space. But it gives me not a lot to talk about. I'm curious what viewers think of the rest of the levels. Certainly there's a lot of vignettes within them. Finding Bowser's submarine in Dire Dire Docks, avoiding being blown away by the giant snowman, catching the ever-devious Ukiki, discovering the ever-charming Dory, but some levels I just don't find a lot of words for, so I'd love to hear if any other levels stick out to people as carrying interesting meaning in its level design or composition. Let me know. What makes all of the levels of Mario 64 so special is in how much they get away with setting a scene in spite of the technical limitations. The levels are all fairly small, and they don't even try to hide this a lot of the time, like how some levels just abruptly end when you reach the outer barrier. We do see some examples of trying to either hide the size of the levels or justify them in-universe, like how in Bob-omb Battlefield, steep slopes along the outside give off the feeling that there could be a game world present outside of the game space, one we just can't reach due to steep hills. Or how Big Boo's haunt justifies itself as a tiny haunted house inside of a cage. The entrance to the level makes Mario shrink down, and then, when we arrive inside of Big Boo's haunt, we're not really bothered at all by the presence of giant cage walls lining the perimeter of the map, because we understand exactly why we're in a space that's closed off. Some levels mask their size well, like how Tick-Tock Clock approximates the interior of a clock and has a consistently circular outer perimeter, creating the feeling that we really are inside the face of a clock. Or how Rainbow Ride takes place up in the sky, and the lack of level geometry gives off the impression that if we fall, we'll fall quite a long ways. But others don't work so well. Lethal Lava Land in particular feels a little undercooked. We can see not only that the lava just stops existing on the outer perimeter of the map, but also that the map is very square, creating no sense that this level takes place anywhere. This is the kind of abstract that borders on surrealism, where I almost want to admire it for being so unnatural, that you could argue it's expressive in an entirely different way from the impressionistic maps like Bob-omb Battlefield. But the inconsistency between levels means that the levels that try to mask their inability to render a lot of map space end up feeling more immersive and, as a result, more engaging to explore. But the scene of every level is noteworthy because each one feels like it could be understood not just as a level, but as a little work of art. Big Boo's haunt being an actual tiny house inside a cage makes it feel like a diorama. Cool Cool Mountain and Snowman's Land feel a little bit like snow globes, given their small, contained winter environments. And then you get levels like Jolly Roger Bay or even Tick-Tock Clock that feel like they could actually function as paintings. In the former case, you get this sort of naturalistic feeling of seeing a real sunken ship, while Tick-Tock Clock benefits from Mario's presence in creating an absurd effect, reminding me of the illustrations one might see in a children's book. Mario 64 is just really expressive in how it makes a game space feel like it means something, even when there is no story within the levels to contextualize meaning inside of them. Instead, there's just this feeling, as if the levels are expressing something through level design that painters express through composition technique and choice of color. But there's more to that thought than you might think. Art movements typically happen in response to some significant cultural or technological shift, like how the printing press increased rates of literacy and gave rise to the first novels, or how the effects of World War II globally led to a series of art movements that explored the devastation that the war had on humanity and our environment. Let's use the example of Impressionism. Impressionism was an art movement that started in the 1870s in France and can be understood as a reaction to cultural and technological shifts. At the time, the culture of the art world was dominated by the Académie des Beaux-Arts, which held annual salons to feature great works of art. These salons were typically very traditionalist, featuring realistic, highly detailed paintings with somewhat drab colors. The Impressionist painters of the era began employing a new style of painting, initially as a protest against the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Rather than using realistic, highly detailed paintings, they would make paintings that were more sketch-like, using selective detailing and leaving portions of the painting less refined or realistic. This created the sense of an impression of the image that they wished to depict, rather than a direct representation. Impressionists embraced modern life as subjects of paintings, and featured more vivid colors with less refined brushstrokes. These were examples of cultural shifts, but there was also a technological shift that influenced the Impressionists. New colors of paint had been invented that weren't in common use in the traditional art world, but saw new use in Impressionist paintings to allow for a more well-rounded palette and more striking color composition. Impressionism soon became very popular even within the salons of the Academy, because of how radically and culturally exciting the style was. But it's important to understand that Impressionism was, in many ways, a response to shifts that were happening prior to the paintings themselves, that Impressionism couldn't exist before a certain moment in time and place. Artists have to work within limitations of their era, and it's when these artistic parameters expand that new movements are formed, and explore how to make art in these new ways. Through this, new art movements explore two questions: what can we do, and what ought we do with art? Now my question is, if we accept that video games are art, and they absolutely are, then can we conceptualize different eras, techniques, etc. as art movements in a similar manner? If art movements can be thought of as a vision of a future for art, an exploration of the new cans and aughts of art in response to new technologies and new cultural realities, then shouldn't we argue the same is true of video games, that games can contain movements within them? I don't think it's far-fetched at all. I think it's actively happening before our eyes and our lifetime. I would argue, for example, that boomer shooters are an art movement within gaming. Boomer shooters are unified by a rejection of the modern design philosophy of shooters after the console shooter boom spurred by the Halo and Call of Duty franchises. Boomer shooters required both cultural and technological realities to shift before they could arise. Indie game development needed to become a viable market, allowing developers with, at the time, niche interests to make games that were oriented around their own nostalgia. And culturally, there needed to be a generation of young developers whose nostalgia was based in mid to late 90s first-person shooter games. Another example is the walking simulator genre. Walking simulators were part of an art movement that was a reaction to the overemphasis on gameplay over narrative. A series of indie developers who were more interested in storytelling than action gained access to tools to tell stories using the engines of first-person shooters, most notably the Source engine. There needed to be a technological change to allow for this kind of storytelling to be possible, but there also needed to be a cultural reality that the developers were reacting to. What distinguishes a movement from a genre? Well, a genre is really just a list of qualities that different works of art share in common that make them easier to group together. Genre can be anything from compositional qualities to historical qualities, narrative qualities, thematic or aesthetic qualities, etc. For me, what distinguishes a movement from a genre is twofold. First, a movement is historically specific. It roughly has a beginning and an end, a moment when the culture or technology is just too far removed from the origins of the movement for new art to really make sense as being a part of that movement. There can still be Impressionist paintings being made today, but that doesn't mean they're part of the Impressionist movement. Second, a movement has an ethos, whereas genre doesn't require one. In other words, the ambitions and goals of a movement are contingent on being a part of the movement, and artists who make art with different ambitions or goals, or who come from a different historical or cultural moment, don't really fit under the movement. Think about it this way. Steel Panther is a hair metal band. That is their genre, but they're not part of a hair metal movement, because not only are they 20 years too late to be part of the history of hair metal, but their ethos is different. The ethos of Steel Panther is nostalgia for hair metal. This is why boomer shooters are different from what we might call old school FPS. Old school FPS are part of a different historical moment, and while they share a lot of surface level similarities, old school FPS games are not motivated by nostalgia. Quake was not designed to make a game that looks and feels like Quake, but Dusk was designed to look and feel like Quake. And those are two different philosophical perspectives on art and design. And for the record, I love both games, but I don't really consider them to be the same thing. So if we're going to discuss games as a movement, we have to discuss them in terms of what a movement really means. A movement is an artistic historical moment in which a number of artists react to cultural or technological shifts by exploring new ideas of what art can and ought to be, sharing a common general list of goals and ambitions. Movements can be part of a genre's infant stage, or could be just a fad that indicates what artists' collective mentality was at the time. So with all that said, here's my core argument. Early 3D gaming is an art movement. Hear me out. Early 3D games are a reaction to a technological shift, namely the advent of 3D rendering in games. They're also a reaction to cultural shifts related to what artists think the purpose of gaming is. Early 3D games experimented with composition, aesthetic, themes, and narrative with a common ambition of advancing the medium of gaming to break away from its roots in the arcades and towards a new art form that was in many ways distinguished from the other artistic mediums. The best way to understand early 3D gaming as a movement is to look at the artistic differences between the eras before and after 3D became a mainstream game design phenomenon. What changed? Well, we see an increased emphasis on narrative across most genres, an increased emphasis on adult themes and content, particularly violence and gun violence especially. We see an increased desire for visual realism and a rejection of the cartoon-like nature of most 2D games. Horror games finally take off and become their own defined genre within the gaming sphere. We see the arrival of other new genres, usually genres that view immersion as a core design ideal, such as first-person shooters and immersive sims. Cutscenes become a more prominent feature of games across the board. Games begin to abandon concepts like high scores and place increased emphasis on exploring an environment and world building, even in genres that were previously not heavily story-focused. We see the increased emphasis also on create a character and games in which the player feels as though they exist in the story. The overall effect of early 3D games on the landscape of gaming is the idea that games can and should be immersive experiences that tell stories that the player feels like they're a meaningful part of. Importantly, early 3D games reject the traditions of genre and began a state of cross-pollinating between genres to create a more comprehensive experience that is more than the sum of gaming's initial artistic inspirations and aspirations. The big statement of early 3D games as a movement is this: video games are no longer just interactive toys or virtual pen and paper games or playable action movies. Video games are a unique art form unto itself. A whole separate video could be made about the advent of the horror genre or FPS or any other genre that gained serious ground due to the possibilities that 3D rendering offered developers. But let's focus in. Let's look at 3D platformers. Early 3D platformers are the most interesting example of early 3D games because platformers were one of the genres that had the most to gain or lose due to the jump to 3D. After all, platformers were the genre that was most movement-based, meaning that physics and physical space play a much larger role for platformers than for most other genres. Super Mario 64, being the first mainstream 3D platformer, set the precedent for a lot of the 3D platformers to come. Mario 64 is a good example of the cross-pollination seen in most genres at the time. The ability to talk to friendly NPCs was lifted from RPGs and adventure games. The shifted focus towards exploration also borrows from RPGs, while the increased emphasis on rudimentary puzzle solving likely has some influence from adventure games. The camera following Mario from an aerial view situated mostly behind him was lifted from RPGs and action-adventure games, and the ability to punch and kick could potentially be influenced by beat-em-ups and fighting games. The exact origin of each influence isn't the point. The point is that Mario 64 is, in many ways, a hybrid of traditional platforming with influences from elsewhere in the gaming world, and Mario 64 set an important precedent in this regard. Future 3D platformers would generally follow suit in viewing outside genre influences as part of their storytelling and ludic language. Importantly, Mario 64, unlike most previous Mario games, could not work as an arcade game. Mario's origins were in the arcade with the original Donkey Kong and Mario Bros., and even Super Mario Bros. On NES was also released as an arcade cabinet titled Super Mario Bros. Versus. But Mario 64, with its more complex gameplay, physics, world building, alongside its lack of a score system and its generally more immersive quality, means that Mario 64 doesn't feel like its roots. It feels like something new, a new way to make games. This is true of most early 3D games, but beyond just being the first great 3D platformer and one of the best ones at that, there's something about Mario 64 that makes it truly special. So we're going to need to back up. In the early stages of a new artistic medium, artists in said medium will typically adapt its initial language from elsewhere. This is why, for example, movies feature a script. Scripts are a carryover from theatrical productions. We can see similar through lines in many popular mediums. TV shows were an extension of feature films as well as radio, books evolved out of the oral storytelling tradition, and even our medium of YouTube evolved out of the home video market, hence why a lot of the earliest YouTube videos are basically home movies uploaded to the internet. Then there's video games. Video games are interesting because there seems to be no predominant launchpad for the language or culture. Instead, games seem to adapt from disparate sources. A lot of early games were adapted from sports, board games, novels, sci-fi movies, some even adapted from bands. If one were to pick the dominant trend of where video games develop their artistic language, it could only really stretch as far as genre. RPGs were influenced mostly by pen and paper games like Dungeons & Dragons. Adventure games were influenced largely by novels, but perhaps the most popular early genre of games, the platformer, has one clear source of inspiration: cartoons. Platformers were effectively interactive cartoons. This is why, for example, most cartoons, when adapted into a video game in the 80s and 90s, were made as platformers. And this makes a lot of sense, because the design of 2D platformers is best suited to cartoons. Platformers need to be very visually vivid in order to make clear to the player what objects in the world are hostile or safe, and in order to broadcast where to go and what to do without needing text prompts to guide the player, which back in the 80s were harder to implement. The emphasis on visuals for communicating gameplay, mixed with technical limitations of the 8-bit and 16-bit eras, and the generally younger market for platformers, meant that modeling their visual style in cartoons was easily the way to go. But there's more to the connection between platformers and cartoons. Platformers rely on floaty characters and a play form of violence that is meant to be mostly inoffensive. Platformers also needed to distinguish themselves branding-wise with distinctive mascots that would draw players in. All things considered, platformers were, almost by their nature, playable cartoons. The best example to illustrate this is the original Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog tells a story using strictly visuals, in a manner similar to something like one might expect from Looney Tunes. There is a clear conflict between Sonic and Dr. Eggman. Sonic is the brave, speedy, youthful hero with attitude. Dr. Eggman is an old man who relies on technology for strength, kidnaps small animals, and is clearly a coward, as suggested by his running away when defeated in battle. The game is almost a soft remake of the Roadrunner cartoon, where you play as the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote has far more advanced methods of trying to get you. All of the information of Sonic needs to be communicated both clearly and non-verbally, using only visual indicators of conflict and characterization. Sonic is a playable cartoon. While this can easily apply to most platformers of the era, the franchise with the most ambiguity in this is, interestingly enough, actually the Mario franchise itself. While Mario games are playable cartoons, they lack the same clear inspiration from cartoons. Looking at the original game in the franchise, the original Donkey Kong is clearly modeled after King Kong, a live-action film that was half a century old at the time. See, the thing about Mario as a franchise is that Mario is less influenced by genre and more influenced by archetype. King Kong wasn't the inspiration because it was the most similar to the gameplay or visual style of games. King Kong was the inspiration because it was the most similar to the intended thematic and emotional experience that Nintendo wanted the players to have. Donkey Kong took place from an omniscient perspective, with players being able to see all of the action of a given level at once. As a result, the distinction between Barrel, Donkey Kong, Pauline, and Mario would be unclear unless made very clear visually, both in terms of actual design and the placement in frame. If Donkey Kong were just another man like Mario, or if he were placed in the middle or bottom of the screen rather than the top, it might not tell the story of what's happening as clearly. So instead, making the villain a giant monkey, the goal a woman, and the hero a blue-collared man, alongside usage of clear game space composition, helped create a clear and easy-to-understand visual narrative. Donkey Kong is simultaneously a story of the valiant knight rescuing the damsel in distress from evildoers, and also the story of David and Goliath, an underdog defeating a much bigger and more dangerous threat through perseverance and courage. This whole story is told just via the imagery itself. This is, in many respects, a playable cartoon. Cartoons, particularly those without dialogue, rely on obvious archetypes to make clear who to relate to, how to connect to the characters and world, and how to understand and process the story without need for dialogue clarification. You get, by just looking at it, that Wile E. Coyote's violent obsession with the Roadrunner becomes his own undoing. It's an almost universal language, as it can transcend culture and language barriers. This is the key to the Mario franchise. Not cartoon influence, but the philosophy of universality in art. Mario seeks to be a franchise that can be understood by all types of people, regardless of age or where you're from. While no game can be truly universal, the Mario franchise, particularly the mainline Super Mario titles, try often to be as universal as games can get, removing elements that might date the games to a certain era or confuse some audiences who might not all be from the same regions as one another. The Mario franchise would remain fixated on archetypes. With Super Mario Bros., they swapped out Pauline with Princess Toadstool, and swapped out Donkey Kong with King Koopa aka Bowser. But otherwise, Super Mario Bros. Is identical in its usage of archetypes to Donkey Kong. And from there, each game has been a remix of these original themes. Importantly though, along the way, the games have grown aesthetically to incorporate elements of folklore and cultural tradition. This is why we get something like the Boos. The Boos aren't based on cartoons, they're based on the general concept of haunted castles, mansions, etc. The idea of a ghost is just adapted into a cartoonish form and given a cute name. Whereas you can see a pretty direct line to cartoons with something like Sonic the Hedgehog, the inspirations behind Mario were intended to keep a bit of that universality that separates Mario from its contemporaries. This is why, for example, Magikoopa wears blue robes and a tall hat. He is not based on a specific wizard, but just on the general concept of a wizard. He's the archetype of the wizard, adapted into the Mario universe. Cartoons and paintings have a lot in common. They both rely on more visual forms of storytelling, using space and subject-object relations in creative ways to communicate meaning. But whereas Mario pulled from influences that could be easily understood universally, the contemporary cartoon landscape that influenced the 80s and 90s 2D platformer scene are far removed from this more universal storytelling language and towards a more culturally specific contemporary mass market appeal. Look at games like Cool Spot, Toe Jam and Earl, Earthworm Jim, and Bubsy. Seeing these games back to back, it becomes clear that platformers were becoming increasingly more culturally specific to the late 80s and early 90s, modeling themselves off of what's marketable to an anticipated youth demographic in the moment, rather than what has universal appeal. This would end up being a problem should the animal mascot with a lot of attitude suddenly become really unpopular or culturally irrelevant. Platformers needed a path forward if they were going to remain not just relevant to the market, but relevant to the culture. And this is where Mario 64 comes in. Mario 64 functions not just as an evolution, but as a reset. And this reset extended into what it was influenced by. Whereas most 2D platformers were influenced by contemporary cartoon culture, Mario 64 distinguished itself by pulling from the cross-cultural abstract storytelling that we see in paintings. The painting conceit is not just a cool gimmick, it ends up being an argument for the future of gaming. It's an argument that games can be more than just products to sell to children, that they're more than just toys. Instead, games can be expressive and carry abstract meanings that can be explored the same way as other art forms. Mario 64 is an interactive painting because, in some ways, most games are interactive paintings. Going back to Donkey Kong, that game can easily be read the same way one would a painting. It contains within it an entire scene where just through composition a story is told. With Mario at the bottom and Donkey Kong at the top holding Pauline captive, we understand that Mario is an average Joe underdog of a man who has to save a woman, presumed to be a love interest, from the hands of an ape by ascending the rafters of a not all that safe construction site. Love, heroism, danger, courage. Donkey Kong, even as a very vague narrative, still communicates themes. It's this combination of unlikely and courageous that makes playing Donkey Kong so universally appealing, but it's communicated in an abstract manner more similar to paintings. Games, prior to Mario 64, tended to be so focused on adapting the language of contemporary mediums of art that were most convenient to the technological capabilities of the era. It's easy to make a dice roll, so it's easy to model games off of TTRPGs. It's easy to make characters that bounce and jump around with sound effects and minimal dialogue, so it's easy to model games off of cartoons. Paintings were, in a sense, a bit harder, mostly due to graphical limitations, but also due to the fact that paintings have no action, and thus nothing can translate into things that players do. So it was actually a difficult task to make the interactive painting concept the primary conceit of Mario 64. But I think that they picked the right time to introduce this concept into the series. Because really, the problem with 3D is that in its early stages, it wasn't able to be an effective means of conveying complex visual information. Most 3D games prior to Mario 64 looked horrible. Mario 64 aged a lot better in part because of a better budget. But even well after Mario 64, a lot of 3D games struggled with making 3D look good, and most early 3D games looked a lot worse than their 2D counterparts. The 2D platformer art style was able to refine itself over the course of at least 15 years by the time Mario 64 was released. Suddenly, with the advent of 3D, developers had to start over largely from scratch. So the art direction for 3D had to pull from some source of inspiration. But what? Well, there was always movies or computer animations, but Mario 64 chose paintings, and for a very clever reason. Because 3D was less refined, it was also more abstract than 2D, requiring polygons to serve as rough impressions of things like hills, clouds, rocks, stairs, elevators, etc. The fact that we even call the Mario 64 elevators elevators is a testament to how much legwork is being done by context. The elevators are literally just checkerboard platforms, but they move in a manner that reminds us of elevators enough that we recognize them as elevators through context. This abstract, almost surrealist design isn't something we often see in movies, but it's something we see in paintings. And this is where Mario 64 understood what most games at the time didn't. If the medium won't allow fidelity, counter with creativity. Recognize not just the potential for 3D to push us into new dimensions of gameplay and design, but also recognize unique ways in which 3D expresses itself artistically. Early 3D games don't have much in the way of narrative or even world, but they sure have a hell of a lot of scene. Because we understand them in a both impressionistic and expressionistic way. Let's elaborate on that. Impressionism is a style of painting that is roughly based on depictions of real scenes. But rather than realism, which attempts to look exactly like how things looked originally, Impressionism conveys the general impression of how things looked, like a sketch version of what would in later drafts begin to look more photorealistic. Impressionism specifically creates more or less vivid detailing in a scene selectively in order to create an emotional realism that allows us to understand the feeling of a space or moment and not just its contents. So an Impressionist painting will become more vivid and detailed around something like a person's face, but their body might be a bit less detailed and more blurry or nondescript. Or a person will be more detailed but the background less detailed. Whatever is the main focus of the painting tends to get the most detail and emphasis in the frame, while whatever details are less relevant end up filling out a soft scene rather than demanding to be focused on. This naturally draws the viewer's eyes to the areas of the painting which have the most detail, which allows the painter to create an emotional impact for the viewer based on where they're most likely to find sites of interest. Mario 64 is very much like an Impressionist painting. First, there's the most vivid details. Mario himself, other characters and moving objects, and sites of serious importance, like the pyramid in Shifting Sandland or the foothill in Bomb Battlefield. Then there are the less detailed pieces of geometry that aren't important to the overall scene or gameplay experience, like pillars that have low-res textures on top, or nondescript sand dunes in Shifting Sandland. Then there's the background itself, aka the skybox, which is literally intangible and often meant to be obscured by the level itself. Looking at Bomb Battlefield, we even see the exact place where level geometry meets with the background. This should shatter any illusion of believability in Mario 64, but it doesn't, because Bomb Battlefield is a world that exists inside a painting, and we understand the space in an impressionistic manner, excising those non-detailed elements of the level from our mind and seeing the sites of significance far more vividly. Our eyes just naturally gravitate away from those areas which are less defined. Importantly, this is done through composition. Looking at Bomb Battlefield, we see, for example, the usage of a clear dirt path that guides the player, both ludically and visually, towards the direction that will eventually lead them to the central areas that all of the stars are found. The levels are often composed in such a way that focuses viewer attention towards that which could be considered the action of the scene, with the inactive portions of the scene being de-emphasized visually. The game is literally composed like an Impressionist painting. This creates an emotional realism to the levels of Mario 64, and this is something 3D is capable of that 2D wasn't able to do with as much clarity or purpose. This is a unique quality of the highly limited nature of early 3D rendering. Then there's Expressionism. Expressionism is like when you take the realism out of the emotional realism of Impressionism. In other words, Expressionism contorts the reality of an image to fit the emotional perspective of the artist. So rather than being an attempt to capture a real moment or place, Expressionism is meant to capture a feeling the artist had, creating scenes that can be very vivid portrayals of something independently of some original reality that inspired it. Mario 64 uses a technique that is reminiscent of Impressionist paintings, but with a somewhat expressionistic ambition, to create a very vivid scene that conjures up a feeling without necessarily having its basis in anything real. We see this in the borderline surreal Bomb Battlefield or Whomp's Fortress, which express the feeling of being the unlikely hero pitted against an absurd and overwhelming threat from groups with power. This isn't necessarily meant to be deep, but it does express an emotional truth that players are meant to be able to relate to. Whomp could be your parents, or bullies in school, or older siblings, or teachers, or even just other villains you've seen in other works of art. But what matters is that you understand Mario and what he's doing without there ever being an explicit story, just an expression of a feeling of being the plumber fighting the good fight. Paintings allow for alternative ways of conceptualizing meaning in art compared to what many are used to from games, movies, and TV. 3D games had an opportunity to explore alternative ways of conceptualizing meaning as well, and Mario 64 evoked the idea of interactive paintings, in my opinion intentionally, to say, hey, games don't need to be cartoons and D&D all the time, we can do other stuff too. Mario 64 is special because it explores the possibilities of reconceptualizing not just how games render their environments, but how games communicate their meaning through environment. They used the model of paintings as a template for designing levels, and through this, they made it clear that games have a lot in common artistically with paintings. People miss the forest for the trees when looking at environment and level design in games, because they're not just means to an end for gameplay. They're little works of art within themselves, and what makes early 3D games so special is in how they had to construct little works of art without much precedent to inform their design or composition. So you get these weird, abstract, experimental levels that sometimes feel half-finished, but always feel really expressive. Sometimes they're realistic, sometimes just random geometric shapes. Sometimes they're coherent and sometimes really disjointed. Sometimes linear and sometimes open-ended. Early 3D platformers in particular excite me because they don't have a uniform gameplay concept. Some are literal translations of 2D to 3D, such as Kirby 64, which is a 2D game with 3D graphics. Some are adaptational, adapting a 2D platforming style into a 3D context, such as Sonic Adventure or Crash Bandicoot, which have 3D movement but place the character on a path that is highly linear like in 2D games. Then there's Mario 64's influence on the collectathons, games which make exploration a primary emphasis in an attempt to get the most out of a 3D environment. Each of these different types of 3D platformers have their own ups and downs, but the common thread between all of them is that environments were more experimental, with a lot of games distinguishing their identities in large part off of what the environments were and how they played. Mario 64 set a precedent for artistic experimentation in a way that would be far less predictive of the mainstream gaming landscape, but far more predictive in the indie scene. Indie story games like The Stanley Parable, Gone Home, and What Remains of Edith Finch are games that use a scene to tell a story in the non-dynamic way that paintings often do. Games like Katamari Damacy, Crypt Worlds, Cruelty Squad, and the Ink Repair catalog all feature expressive imagery and abstract narratives that would be at home alongside the aesthetic mashup of levels like Bowser in the Sky. Despite the fact that there are endless games that share Mario 64's DNA or take after Mario 64 as a clear or subtle influence, there's just about no other game that feels like Mario 64. For me, this is because Mario 64 is the perfect example of an abstract platformer, where the emotional experience is told through a progression in a level devoid of a broader, clearly defined story. Many games feel like a world in which a story is being told. I've already covered Shadow of the Colossus and Half-Life 2 on this front, but those games still have a plot that informs every step of the process. Mario 64, on the other hand, has an overarching story that gives way to a series of abstract vignettes. While the broader story of Mario 64 is Save Princess Peach, that has no direct relationship to Grab Ukiki at the top of Tall Tall Mountain. Instead, there's a feeling of each world being its own story, its own scene, and that makes Mario 64 feel so unique. Contrast this with, for example, Gex 64. Gex 64 is a game that has a similar conceit of entering into levels that are their own self-contained worlds, and in the case of Gex 64, they're TV shows. But Gex 64's levels don't feel like TV shows in any way. Instead, they feel like tropes that are pasted onto levels that otherwise don't have any specific reason to be TV shows. They don't significantly borrow from the language of TV in their aesthetic or design. Meanwhile, Mario 64's level design does feel to some degree like interacting with paintings, because the game sets a scene for the player to explore the way that a viewer of a painting will explore the details of the frame. The levels aren't dynamic like a TV show, they're largely static, like a painting. Mario 64 opens the door to think of games in new ways and to embrace the abstract elements of storytelling and world design that 2D games were increasingly rejecting. There's a lot of potential in the abstract, the impressionist, the expressionist, rather than in just the realism that has come to be most favored in graphics, world design, and game feel in AAA titles. If you haven't, try finding some games that look, feel, and play like something you've never experienced before. You'll be surprised to find how much more there is to games when they're not expected to rigidly adhere to the most popular industry norms and standards. Mario 64 doesn't tell its story through any big moments, but just a series of little scenes. A ship trapped in the seabed long ago. A piano lit softly by the moonlight. The sight of a pyramid in the distance. A staircase that ascends forever. Mario 64 is a painting you can play. But Mario 64 isn't the only example of games doing this. Games regularly use the storytelling techniques of paintings in the way they construct levels. Game spaces are interactive paintings in many respects, whether they try to be or not. The bonfire that sits at the base of the Tomb of the Giants in Dark Souls is the one source of light in a place no other light can reach. Situated next to the remains of the bones of giants immediately tells the player that this bonfire represents hope in a hopeless land. Dark Souls is a painting you can play. Doom opens on a futuristic base, with the immediate sight of a mangled corpse in the room, suggesting hostility from a likely inhuman force ahead. Doom is a painting you can play. The game space is used to communicate meaning to the player in the visual, non-narrative manner in which paintings communicate meaning. The map is art, and it's an art form so often overlooked because we've become conditioned to mostly adapt our understanding of storytelling from more narratively focused mediums in processing what games say. Mario 64 offers a vision of a future for games, where the abstract meaning we can get from visual storytelling like in paintings, carries over into how games tell their own stories. A future where games are not restricted by narrative tradition or mass market appeal, but instead explore the meaning of space and world as much as the meaning of plot and character. This future would be realized across the board, whether consciously or not. Games would continue to explore ways of communicating meaning using game space. And importantly, a lot of games would expand the nature of how game spaces could be used artistically as part of an aesthetic, thematic, and emotional experience. For me, the most exciting moves forward on this front have been some of the more experimental games that come out of the indie gaming market in the past decade or so. Games like The Eternal Cylinder, The Long Drive, The Stanley Parable, The Beginner's Guide, Umurangi Generation, Cruelty Squad, Papers, Please, MyHouse.wad, all serve as examples of how games have pushed boundaries artistically and used game spaces in a creative manner of doing so. The past decade or so is when I feel like games finally became their own artistic language separate from the mediums they're influenced by. Games for so often wanted to be movies, wanted to be books, sports, that they never quite figured out how to be games. Super Mario 64 is one of those games that feels like it was designed under the philosophy of games as a unique artistic language. It's an interactive painting, not because games should be more like paintings, but because the artistic language of games is more like paintings than most developers were consciously aware of. This is why Mario 64 is able to feel both dated and timeless. Its gameplay isn't part of mainstream gaming anymore, apart from the actual 3D Mario titles themselves, but its ethos has become woven into the fabric of gaming itself. Games are more expressive and expansive now because Mario 64 gave the industry a jump start needed to think of 3D in more creative ways than strictly an adaptation of ideas that were conceptualized in the 80s and early 90s. Its influence was felt most directly on the collectathon platformers of the N64 and GameCube eras, but while that trend largely died off, the trend of exploration-based, abstract environmental storytelling that allows 3D games to feel like a portal into a whole other world is felt across all of gaming. Mario 64 conceptualized a realm of possibilities that weren't available in the 2D era, and we're better off for it. Thanks for watching. This video was originally meant as the first of a series of videos exploring early 3D platformers through the concept of scene, analyzing their level design and world building in the way one might analyze a painting, focusing on compositional elements. That series became too ambitious to follow through on, but if that series idea interests anyone, let me know in the comments and I'll take it into consideration. Future planned videos would be about Crash Bandicoot, Banjo-Kazooie, Rocket, Robot on Wheels, among others. I also had plans to make a video about Super Mario Sunshine that I'm still interested in, and this video could be viewed as a launchpad to making videos covering each of the 3D Mario games in detail, although not necessarily using the same analytical framework. If you're interested in seeing long-form videos about Sunshine, the Galaxy games, 3D World, or Mario Odyssey, let me know. If you're new to the channel and want to see more videos like what you just watched, I recommend my short-form videos on Mario franchise games, including my videos A Brief Moment of Meaning in Mario Sunshine, Luigi's Mansion, and Mario 64. If any of these videos appeal to you, then subscribing to the channel will help us both out, so please consider it. This video and others like it would not be possible without the support of my patrons. Patrons get access to long-form videos early, get their name in the credits, and play an instrumental role in making these videos come out in a timely fashion. It's only $1 per video, and I make a max of 2 videos per month. Please consider supporting the channel if you can, and I hope everyone has a great day.